Welcome back to the Real News Network, coming to you from Washington, D.C. And this is the final in our series of interviews with Eugene Jarecki, who wrote the book, The American Way of War. He's the filmmaker of Why We Fight, which won a Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival and a 2006 Peabody Award. Thanks for joining us again. Thanks. So we left off talking about to talk about the Iraq War. So the military-industrial complex, much of the foreign policy establishment, a position was articulated by John McCain in the election campaign, which many of these people agree with, which is you don't leave Iraq unless you've won. So how strong is that position? What does winning mean? And what do you think in terms of this pullout of Iraq?
I mean, I think that I heard Tom Ricks talking about this recently. He had just come back from Baghdad, and he reported on a conversation he had with an ambassador, I think it was a UK ambassador perhaps to Iraq, who said to him that the major events of the Iraq War had yet to happen. I take the view that Iraq has gone quiet for a time. I'm not confident at all in the assessments of a restored situation, of peace is at hand, I think they said. In Vietnam, they said it about 1,000 times. I have no reason to believe that Iraq is a resolved situation or that it will resolve anytime soon. And so when I hear troop strength estimates and troop withdrawal plans that are many, many months away, and they move around, one time it's 16, then it's 19, then it's 13, then 23, this seems like the usual back and forth about policy that goes on, and it's waiting for an incident. I mean, what if Iraq, as we've seen in the past 2 weeks, heats back up? We've seen a tremendous increase in violence in Iraq just in the last 2 weeks. What if that were to continue? That trend continued, would we say, well, we have to win? At what point would you be able to say that you've won? How can you ever know if you've won in a country that has been destabilized by so many decades of outside involvement and internal fracturing? And so when you set an illusory standard like Senator McCain did, that you can't leave until you've won, you're basically just saying, get prepared, folks. This is a permanent war footing.
Well, I think one, it's a permanent war footing, but I think perhaps there is something to how one would define winning. The 19th century saw more or less the end of colonization. The colonial powers came to the conclusion it doesn't pay to be a direct colonial power. It's far better to have a local elite and partner with a local elite to exploit and plunder your colony than try to do it directly. If you translate that into Iraq, it doesn't pay for America to have to colonize Iraq, but to leave requires a dependable elite that you can partner with. So winning, I assume, in McCain's eyes means we can't leave until there's a dependable elite in some kind of stable situation.
Yeah, but I don't think it works that way anymore. What the colonists learned 100 years ago was in a different age. We live now in the age in which mass destruction has been democratized. The tools of real destructive power have been put in the hands of everyday people. And so the Saudi family sits all the time waiting for the day when the shoe is going to drop, and they are imperiled in a way they were never imperiled before. And the same is true in Iraq. I don't know that it's just we need a dependable elite. You could have all the dependable elite you want. If the country wants to engulf them, they'll engulf them. Chalmers Johnson said it very well in my film. He said, the reason we didn't have an exit strategy for Iraq is we never intended to leave. Think of it this way. The Vietnam War took place in the time it took place and was this extraordinarily destructive and erosive conflict for the United States. But ultimately, we could always have left. It was, after all, a satellite skirmish between ourselves and communist powers playing itself out in a kind of a jungle area of Southeast Asia, an area that did not have, for example, the lifeblood of the planet under its soil.
Right.
In the Middle East, you cannot just leave. You cannot just depart the way we did in Southeast Asia, and everybody knows that. So you have
the plan was clearly not to leave. The plan was you don't build these kind of military infrastructure, military bases with the plan to leave.
Sure, but it doesn't. But just because people then say, "Hey, it's politic now to say X number of months until we leave," doesn't forget the issue that this country has not yet committed itself to alternative energy, and the number one source of energy in the world is under the sands of that country. And so the idea that we have built those bases with the intent to keep an eye on the reserves in that part of the world, but that we're suddenly, for for political reasons or electoral reasons or some other pragmatic reason here on the ground, going to sort of abandon that and hope that we can keep our oil costs down. Remember, the goal of the United States in the Middle East from the beginning had to do with petroleum being the lifeblood of our society and the lifeblood of our global dominance. So we're not about to turn our back on that just because somebody said some number in a campaign, or somebody's now saying a number in a first year of an election of a new elected candidate. So I think that you have a situation where I don't believe any of us know how this future for Iraq will unfold, but I do lean toward the idea that we will ever depart in any meaningful way in the short term. I don't believe in that idea, and I think that that's rhetoric. It's rhetoric by politicians.
Now, of course, the other side of this is what the Iraqis say, because the Iraqis have now negotiated an agreement, which the Iraqis are calling a withdrawal agreement. Here they're still calling it a status of forces agreement.
Right.
But the Iraqi government, at least, is saying, this is you're out completely by 2011, and you signed this deal.
Sure. And of course, as the Iraqi government and the U.S. continue to disagree over that paradigm, the risk of increased violence on the ground rises. As the risk of increased violence rises, I go back to that ambassador who said the events of the Iraq War, the major ones, have yet to occur.
But he also said, if I remember that, I heard that quote as well, he said most of these events will happen after we leave, if I understood correctly.
But I don't understand what after we leave means. You can leave on a Monday and be back in on a Tuesday. You think we would leave on a Monday and an oil event goes on Tuesday with the pricing and we're not back in? We're not stupid. Well, I guess we are actually, but we're not stupid enough to be stupid in terms of not having found alternative energy, and now be stupid about risking the one source we do have.
So what does that make of President Obama's promise?
Well, you know, part of this is also, I listen to myself and I'm thinking, you know, Eugene, you could mislead people to buy into this rhetoric about foreign oil. I've been listening to this foreign oil argument from Obama and several other politicians. You know what the number one supplier of oil to this country is?
Canada.
Canada. So, first of all, why didn't we declare war on Canada, for one thing?
Well, if you go through the whole list,
Yes.
We need to have an alternative supply of energy to get off our adversaries who are supplying oil. But
Yes.
you go through the list of top suppliers, you can't really find an adversary.
That's right. So it's this strange thing where Americans have bought into the idea that the reason we need to get into alternative energies to stop our dependence on foreign oil. That's what I keep hearing. Well, that's not really what's at stake. We're getting most of our oil from countries that are not in that position. And so it's just more of the same hyping up the enemy. I mean, in that case, they're doing it for green policies. Let's stop hyping up the enemy. What America needs to do is find a role in the world for being a leader among equals.
But
not
the issue
for being a
of, the issue of
country in the
controlling
circumference.
Middle East oil is,
Yeah.
is if you take this fundamental pillar of U.S. policy that America has to have
Yes.
the dominant power, you also take into consideration you want to control the world's oil supply,
Yes.
whether you need it right away yourself or not.
Yes, and guide the pricing. That's a huge part of this. And, you know, for me, we are living in a time that will have tremendous transition going on in every way that we're seeing, from the collapses economically to what we're going to do about healthcare, what we're going to do about complicating national security matters, porous borders, the democratization of the tools of destruction. All of these things are going on, and yet we have certain policies that are being guided by constants. This constant about our dependence on petroleum, and so you can spin these arguments for where we're going to go or not go as much as you want to, but if you look at our interest in Afghanistan, our interest in Pakistan, our interest with Israel, our interest with Iraq, and of course the rhetoric we've been saber rattling with Iran, these are all just fruit of an old paradigm. And when I heard that Obama was going to do this message to the Iranian people and to the Iranian leadership, yes, that is a breath of fresh air. That is something that people in the Middle East and around the world will perceive as a different brand of America conducting herself in the world. He should do more of that and less saber rattling about places like Afghanistan and Pakistan.
In his talk to the Iranians, he said something about Iran taking up its proper place in the community of nations.
Yeah.
And that's a really enormous question in the sense, is the United States now willing to accept Iran as a regional power or not? Certainly Israel, or at least the right wing of Israel, will not accept Iran as a regional power.
Well,
will the United States accept that it really has that role?
Sure. When you raise the idea, though, in that sentence, I'm more focused on the phrase community of nations. Barack Obama embracing the idea of a community of nations is already a gigantic departure from what we saw in the past 8 years, where this country seemed to not only be declaring war on Iraq, but to get to Iraq, we declared war on the community of nations itself. Bush and company did a great deal to undermine the United Nations, to blackmail people in the United Nations, to basically invalidate the United Nations as an international arbitrating body. And so for Barack Obama to underscore when he's asking Iran to conduct itself in the spirit of a community of nations, he's doing a great deal to remind the world that it's still possible to have an America that has regard for a community of nations. I think that's a starting point for any invitation, which otherwise would have fallen on deaf ears.
And if Obama has suggested this will be the case, but I guess what the people of the world are waiting to find out is perhaps less whether Iran joins the community of nations
whether we do.
than whether the United States
Yes.
actually does, because 8 years of not caring much about international law
Sure.
has changed people's minds about
You know,
that.
I watched this when Barack Obama first came into the White House. Some of the early rhetoric, when you saw it in constellation, was troubling. And I think this is something that as he becomes more sovereign in his role there, as he becomes more aware, I think one of the things Barack Obama seems to be learning is that it doesn't help him all that much to sort of kowtow to old, long-standing, very hawkish interests in the American establishment. They don't seem to be very pleased when he caters to them anyway. They go after him anyway. So he should, I think, at a certain point, maybe try a no more Mr. Nice Guy position where he says, hey, I was elected to actually represent a better America in the world, and so I'm going to tone down the rhetoric and try to build some bridges. And I think that's what this new outreach to Iran is about. And that does have to do with letting the world know that America recognizes its own shortcomings in our history. We've got great things about us, and we've had moments where we weren't right. We weren't right.
And just as a final point, what did you make of the Charles Freeman appointment, then non-appointment?
Out of my expertise.
Okay.
But I'll say one other thing about that, which is the one thing, when I hear Obama talking, and it came in this constellation, the world hears two things at the same breath recently. They hear, we want Iran to disarm itself from a nuclear perspective. We have full support for Israel. I'm an American Jew. Israel is a nuclear power. We're allowed to say that, right? It's a nuclear power. When the world hears that we believe that some countries are fit to be nuclear powers and some countries are not, the world does not see that as a new way of doing business in the world. The world sees that as the same double standard that America has been willing to embrace forever. And when you're willing to do that, it's like if you watched your parent commit a crime and 5 minutes later they want you to clean your room. You don't have credibility for me. You will have credibility for me when you live up to the what was it? Live up to your own creed. Live up to your own promises as a nation. We have to do that. Obama's a wonderful opportunity for that. If he leads from that, everything else will follow. But if he leads from the same old rhetoric and double standard ideas about who's in the club of nuclear powers and who's not, and who's in the community of nations and who's not, that will fail.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And don't forget my pointing to the donate button, because if you don't donate, we don't do this. Thank you.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington is a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country is governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said, in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.